The first thing that reached the hill was not gunfire. It was a sound below the tree line in the dark, where nothing was supposed to be walking. Boots breaking through crusted snow, then a bugle, thin and flat in air, so cold it seemed to carry sound badly. Captain William Barber had commanded Fox Company for less than a month. His Marines did not know him well, and several of them did not like him much. That afternoon he had made them dig into ground, frozen hard as concrete, on a bare knob of hill above a mountain road, while every man on the slope told himself the war was already over, and they would all be home by Christmas. They chipped at the earth with entrenching tools until the blades rang. They piled rocks. They cut pine boughs and laid them across shallow scrapes because that was as deep as the ground would allow. He had 234 Marines, 12 Navy corpsmen, and 1 Korean interpreter. He had 3 rifle platoons, 3 60mm mortars, 2 81mm mortars, 2 heavy machine guns on tripods, and a horseshoe of hastily scratched holes around the crest of a hill roughly the size of 3 football fields. Behind him, 7 miles down a single lane of gravel, sat 8,000 United States Marines at a village called Udam-ni. In front of him, 7 more miles of that same road ran down to the division base at Hagaru-ri. There was no other road. There was no second route. The pass beneath his position was the only ground link between those 2 halves of the 1st Marine Division, and it was the only way out of the mountains for either of them. The temperature that night has been estimated at roughly minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind coming off the reservoir that pushed the effective cold far lower. It was the night of November the 27th, 1950. At around 2 in the morning, a Chinese division came up the slope. Before we go any further, I want to ask a small favour. Cold War Impact is a small channel covering Cold War and military history, and lately our views and reach have fallen off sharply. If you value carefully researched history like this, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing the video. Every single interaction helps this channel reach new viewers and lets me keep making documentaries at this depth. Now, back to the hill above Toktong Pass. Over the next 5 nights, the road stayed open. When the shooting finally stopped, 26 of Barber's men were dead, 89 were wounded, and 3 were missing. Only about 82 were still able to walk down the hill without help. What kept that road open was not a breakthrough. It was not a bombing campaign. It was not a fresh division rushed up from the coast because there was no fresh division and no way to move one. The thing that saved the 1st Marine Division was already sitting on that hill before anybody knew the Chinese were there. It had been put there the previous afternoon as a precaution by a colonel who could not stop worrying about a road, and it consisted of 1 rifle company that had not yet fired a shot in the campaign. To understand how a single company came to be standing between an entire division and annihilation, we have to go back 3 weeks, to the moment the United States military decided that the Chinese army was not in Korea at all. By the middle of November 1950, the Korean War looked finished. The Incheon landing in September had cut the North Korean army in half. Seoul had been retaken. United Nations forces had crossed the 38th parallel and were driving north through a collapsing enemy. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from Tokyo, had told his staff and then the press that the offensive would end the war and that the troops would be home by Christmas. The intelligence picture that supported this belief was, in hindsight, close to worthless. Chinese soldiers had already been captured in October. Prisoners taken in the north told interrogators plainly that large Chinese forces were in Korea. Patrols reported contact with units that did not fit the North Korean order of battle. In late October and early November, Chinese formations struck hard at both the 8th Army in the west and at units advancing in the east, inflicted serious damage, and then broke contact and vanished into the hills. The most violent of those warnings came at a place called Unsan in the first days of November. There, elements of the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division were struck at night by a Chinese force that came in from the flank and rear, cut the regiment's line of withdrawal, and effectively destroyed one of its battalions. Men who escaped described bugles, encirclement in darkness, and an enemy that appeared in strength on ground where no enemy was supposed to exist. More than 1,000 men of the regiment were initially posted as missing, and although several hundred stragglers came in over the following days, the regiment lost about 1/3 of its strength. It was, by any reasonable reading, a full-scale intervention by a modern army announcing itself. Then, as before, the Chinese broke contact and disappeared. That disappearance was the most dangerous thing that happened because it was read as weakness rather than as design. Major General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief in Tokyo, had built an assessment that the Chinese presence in Korea was limited, that it consisted of volunteers rather than formed divisions, and that it was intended to protect the hydroelectric plants along the Yalu rather than to fight a campaign. As late as November 24, Willoughby was estimating that no more than 34,000 Chinese were in Korea. The command's upper figure, after a month of revisions, reached 60 to 70,000. Reports from the field that contradicted this were routinely revised downward as they passed upward through the chain, on the reasoning that frightened soldiers overestimate the numbers in front of them. There is a structural point here that outlives the specific war. The intelligence failure at Chosin was not primarily a failure to collect information. Prisoners had been taken, contacts had been made, divisions had been identified by name. It was a failure to accept information that contradicted a decision already made at the top, in a command culture where contradicting that decision was professionally expensive. Every piece of evidence that arrived was measured against the conclusion, instead of the conclusion being measured against the evidence. The true number of Chinese troops in Korea by late November was in the region of 300,000 men, roughly 30 divisions, or more than 4 times the highest figure the command was prepared to accept. In the northeast, opposite the Marines, an entire army group of 12 divisions had already arrived and had been in position, unobserved, for the better part of 3 weeks. The advance continued. The 1st Marine Division, under Major General Oliver Smith, was ordered north from the coast up a single mountain road toward the Chosin Reservoir, a frozen body of water the Koreans called Changjin. The road climbed from sea level to more than 4,000 feet through a series of passes so narrow that in places 2 trucks could not pass one another. Smith did not like any of it. He had told his superiors in writing that his division was being strung out along a supply line it could not defend in mountains in winter against an enemy nobody could account for. He slowed his advance deliberately. He built an airstrip at Hagaru-ri that he had not been asked to build. Those 2 decisions later saved thousands of lives, and at the time they earned him a reputation for excessive caution. By November 27, the division was spread across 78 miles of that road. 2 reinforced regiments, the 5th and the 7th Marines, sat at Udamni on the western side of the reservoir, under orders to attack west the following morning. 14 miles behind them at Hagaru-ri sat the division command post, the new airstrip, and a thin garrison. 11 miles behind Hagaru-ri was Koto-ri. 10 miles beyond that, Chinhung-ni. Between each of these points ran nothing but the road. Colonel Homer Litzenberg commanded the 7th Marines. He was not a man given to optimism, and the geometry of his position bothered him more than it bothered anyone above him. If the enemy cut that 14-mile stretch anywhere along its length, everything forward of the cut would be isolated in the mountains, with no line of supply, no line of evacuation, and no way to bring artillery or armour to bear on the block. He looked at his map and picked the single worst place for that to happen. It was a saddle of high ground at about 4,000 feet, where the road bent through a defile, roughly halfway between the 2 positions. On the maps, it was Toktong Pass. On the afternoon of November 27th, Litzenberg detached Fox Company from the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines and ordered it to occupy the hill overlooking that pass and hold it. He did not know the Chinese were there. He was, by his own account, simply refusing to leave the only road unguarded. It was an administrative precaution. It was the last order given before the trap closed, and it was the only reason the trap did not work. The men who came up that slope after midnight belonged to the 9th Army Group of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, and they were commanded by one of the most capable soldiers in Asia. Song Shilun was 43 years old. He had entered the Whampoa Military Academy as a teenager, joined the Communist Party in 1926, and had been fighting more or less continuously ever since. He had survived the Long March. He had commanded at corps level in the Chinese Civil War and had helped destroy nationalist armies far larger than his own. His army group, 3 armies of 4 divisions each, had been trained and staged for an amphibious assault on Taiwan. When Chinese intervention in Korea was decided, those divisions were redirected north instead. They began crossing the Yalu River on November 5, 1950. Something in the region of 120,000 men moved into the mountains of northeastern Korea over the following 3 weeks, and American aerial reconnaissance did not detect them. That failure was not luck. It was the result of a marching discipline that has few parallels in modern military history. The columns moved only at night. At first light, they dispersed into villages, tree lines, mine shafts, and hillside cuts, camouflaged themselves, and lay motionless through the daylight hours. Officers were authorized to shoot men who broke cover or lit fires. Aircraft passed over them daily and saw empty country. Song's plan for the reservoir was not subtle, and it did not need to be. He intended to let the Marines advance into the mountains, then sever the road at multiple points simultaneously, splitting the division into isolated pockets and destroying them one at a time. The 79th and 89th Divisions would strike the concentration at Udom-ni. The 58th Division would attack Hagaru-ri. The 60th would seize the road below Koto-ri. East of the reservoir, the 80th and 81st would fall on an army task force, and the 59th Division, 10,000 men on paper, would take the road between Udom-ni and Hagaru-ri and hold Toktong Pass. Chinese infantry tactics at this stage of the war were built entirely around what they lacked. They had almost no artillery, very little armour, and no air force over the battlefield. What they had was numbers, night, and terrain. Attacks went in after dark to neutralise American air power and observed artillery fire. Signalling below battalion level was done with bugles, whistles, and cymbals because radios did not exist at that level. Assaults followed a principle Chinese commanders described as 1 point, 2 sides. Reconnaissance parties probed a defensive line until they found its weakest seam. Then a concentrated force drove into that single point, while other elements swung around both flanks to envelop it. Against a scattered, road-bound, overconfident enemy in mountains at night, it was close to perfect. Song's officers had reason to expect a short campaign. Their intelligence on American dispositions was excellent, their approach had gone completely undetected, and they would be attacking a division dispersed along 78 miles of single-track road. Their assumption was straightforward. Once the road was severed, the Marines above the break would be finished because there was nothing at any of the cut points capable of holding. At Toktong Pass, that assumption was wrong by one rifle company. The 9th Army Group had one catastrophic problem, and it had nothing to do with the Americans. The divisions redirected from the Taiwan operation had been equipped and clothed for the subtropical coast of southeastern China. They were sent into one of the coldest winters recorded in northern Korea, into mountains above 4,000 feet, in cotton uniforms and canvas shoes. Many had no gloves. Many had no proper hats. Rail movement was so hurried that in some cases, winter clothing stockpiled at the border was never issued. Soldiers went into the mountains with a few days of cooked grain and no resupply worth the name, because Chinese logistics could not push food up those roads under air attack. Frostbite began killing men before a single shot was fired. Chinese soldiers froze to death in their assembly positions. Weapons failed in the cold exactly as American weapons did, but the Chinese had no heated tents, no vehicles to warm in, and no aircraft dropping supplies to them. Their offensive power came in violent bursts of 2 or 3 nights, after which units simply had to stop because the men could not be fed and could not be kept alive in the open. Chinese accounts of the campaign record an episode that has become the emblem of it in China. The 6th Company of the 177th Regiment, part of the same 59th Division that was fighting for Toktong Pass, was sent forward to establish an ambush position on high ground and ordered to hold it until the signal to attack. It was found later still in position, roughly 125 men at their posts in firing attitudes, frozen to death where they lay waiting. Chinese sources name 2 other companies lost the same way. That specific account comes from Chinese official histories. It has been heavily promoted by the Chinese state in recent years, and it is not open to public question inside China. It should be received with that in mind. What is not in question is the underlying pattern because it is confirmed from both directions. American Marines described finding Chinese dead in position who bore no wounds, and the Army Group's own casualty returns record more men lost to cold than to American weapons. This is the element of the Chosin campaign that is most often left out of the American telling of it, and leaving it out makes the story smaller. The men who came up Fox Hill in the dark were not an inexhaustible mass. They were soldiers who had been marched into mountains their own supply system could not reach, in clothing intended for a subtropical coast, by a command that had accepted those losses in advance as the price of surprise. They attacked because stopping was also fatal. Song Shailun understood this. It is the reason he committed so heavily on the first night. He had a narrow window in which his army could still fight, and he intended to finish the Marines inside it. On the hill above Toktong Pass, Barber had spent the afternoon making decisions that would have looked excessive to almost anyone. The hill was a rough horseshoe. The road ran along its base to the north. To the south and above it rose higher ground, a rocky knoll, and beyond that, a ridge climbing toward the peak of Toktong San. Barber did not have the men to occupy that high ground, and he knew it. Anyone holding it would be able to fire down into his position. He placed the 3rd Platoon under Lieutenant Robert McCarthy on the crest facing the saddle, the most exposed sector on the hill. 2nd Platoon under Lieutenant Elmo Peterson held the western slope. 1st Platoon under Lieutenant John Dunn held the east. The machine guns went where they could cover the approaches. Lieutenant Joseph Brady set the mortars in the centre of the horseshoe and, critically, registered them in daylight on the knoll and the ridge, so that fire could be called onto those features in darkness without adjustment. Lieutenant Campbell, the artillery observer, established communication with the howitzers at Hagaruri, 7 miles away. Those howitzers were the position's other advantage, and they nearly were not there at all. Howe Battery of the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, 105mm guns under Captain Benjamin Reed, was sighted on the exposed edge of the Hagaruri perimeter. When Reed was told to pull his guns back inside the defended line, he asked permission to stay where he was. From further back, his guns could not reach Toktong Pass. From where they sat at nearly maximum range, they could just barely put shells on the hill's approaches. He stayed. Then Barber ordered his company to dig in, and the men complained about it. The ground was frozen solid. It was late, they were exhausted from the climb, the war was supposedly ending, and they were being made to hack at rock in the dark by a captain most of them still regarded as an unfamiliar and unnecessarily strict newcomer. They dug anyway, shallow scrapes lined with pine boughs and ringed with piled stone. Every survivor's account agrees on what that order was worth a few hours later. The attack came in around 2 in the morning against McCarthy's 3rd Platoon on the crest, exactly where the terrain invited it. Chinese assault troops had crawled to within grenade range under cover of darkness before opening fire. The first burst of shooting killed and wounded Marines in their sleeping bags in a fight that began at a distance measured in yards. The seam they found was on the 3rd Platoon's flank, where a fire team of 3 men covered the approach from a natural draw. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 were hit. The Marine still fighting was Private First Class Hector Cafferata, a 19-year-old reservist from New Jersey who had joined the company only days before and had been asleep when the attack began. He came out of his bag without boots and without a parka, because in the dark and the noise he could not find either. He fought the rest of that night in his stocking feet, in snow, at temperatures around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Beside him, Private First Class Kenneth Benson had been blinded when a grenade detonated close to his face, filling his eyes with grit and blast debris. Benson could not see well enough to aim, so the 2 men worked out an arrangement in the dark. Benson loaded rifles by touch and passed them up. Cafferata fired them. He held that gap for hours. When Chinese grenades landed among the wounded lying near him, he threw them back, and when there was no time to throw, he swung at them with an entrenching tool. By his own later estimate, he knocked away roughly a dozen that way. 1 grenade went off as it left his hand, taking part of a finger and tearing up his arm. He kept fighting until a sniper's bullet finally put him down. The official Medal of Honor citation Cafferata received credits him with 15 enemy killed. The figure that circulated among the men who walked that ground afterward was very much higher, well over 100 in the draw below his position. That larger number rests on the recollection of officers who saw the ground in daylight, not on any formal count, and it should be treated as testimony rather than as an audited fact. What is beyond dispute is that the line did not break where he was standing. Elsewhere along the crest it very nearly did. Chinese troops got onto the hilltop itself. Marines fought them at conversational distance in the dark with rifles, grenades, entrenching tools, and in some cases with hands. Barber moved along the line through all of it. In the course of the first 2 nights on the hill, a bullet struck him in the pelvis and lodged against the bone. He refused evacuation. For the remainder of the action, he directed the defense first with a makeshift crutch. Then, as the wound stiffened and swelled in the cold, from a stretcher his men carried from position to position. By dawn, the perimeter had been restored. The company had lost roughly a third of its effective strength in a single night. Accounts differ slightly on the first day's tally, with some giving 20 dead and 54 wounded, and others 24 dead and 50. The variation is the ordinary friction of counting casualties on a hillside in the dark, and it does not change what the numbers meant. Fox Company had begun the campaign with about 246 men on that hill. It now had roughly 160 who could fight. In front of the position, in daylight, the Marines counted more than 450 Chinese dead. Then a second problem announced itself, and it was worse than the first. The road was gone. Everywhere. The 59th Division had not merely attacked Fox Hill. It had cut the main supply route at several points along its length, and the other Chinese divisions had done the same thing at Udumni, at Hagaru-ri, and at Koto-ri. There was no continuous friendly ground anywhere in the reservoir area. Every American position was now a separate island. On the second day, an attempt was made to reach Fox Company by road from Hagaru-ri. It did not get through. Chinese blocking positions along the route were too strong, and the relief force was stopped and turned back before it came anywhere near the pass. At Udumni, a company-sized effort to push south toward Barber met the same result and lost heavily doing it. The most expensive demonstration of what the road had become happened the following day, and it happened to somebody else. A mixed force of about 900 men was assembled at Koto-ri to fight its way north to Hagaru-ri, 11 miles away, and reinforce the garrison there. It was placed under Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale of the British Royal Marines and included his own 41st Independent Commando, a company of United States Marines, a company of United States Army Infantry, a tank platoon, and a long tail of trucks carrying headquarters personnel and supplies. The column entered a stretch of valley where the road ran between steep slopes held on both sides, and the Chinese let the head of it pass before cutting it in the middle. What followed lasted through the night. The column was chopped into separate pieces that could not support one another. The trucks in the center were destroyed or immobilized on the road, and men fought in isolated groups in the dark with no clear idea of where the rest of the force was. Roughly 300 men reached Hagaru-ri. Drysdale himself was wounded and got through with them. Around 300 more were killed or wounded, and about 135 were taken prisoner. More than half the vehicles were destroyed on the road. Marines afterward called the place Hellfire Valley. That action is the correct measure of what Barber was refusing when he declined the offer to fight his way out. Drysdale's force had armour, a road, daylight at the start, and roughly 4 times Fox Company's numbers, and it was cut to pieces covering 11 miles. Fox Company would have been attempting the same thing with a third of its men already casualties, dozens of stretcher cases, no vehicles and no armour, downhill into terrain the enemy occupied on both sides. Late in the day, Litzenberg reached Barber on the radio and told him the truth. There was no help coming. Nothing at Hagaru-ri could be spared, and nothing at Udumni could break through. Barber was then given the option that mattered. He could attempt to fight his company out, abandon the hill, and try to reach friendly lines. Barber declined. He said his position was still holding, that he had wounded who could not be moved, and that if he left the pass, the road would be closed for good. His reply was recorded in 3 words: "We will hold." This is the part of the story that is most often flattened into a slogan, and it deserves to be looked at properly. It was not a gesture. Barber had made a cold assessment. Moving off the hill meant carrying dozens of stretcher cases across open ground in daylight downhill into an enemy that outnumbered him enormously and occupied the terrain on both sides of the road. His company would have been destroyed in the attempt, and the pass would have been surrendered for nothing. Staying meant holding a position he could not fully cover, with a third of his men already gone and no prospect of relief. He chose the one of those 2 that still contained a possibility. By the 3rd day, the geometry of the entire campaign had narrowed to that hilltop. At Udumni, the 2 Marine regiments had been ordered to stop attacking west and prepare to withdraw southeast toward Hagaru-ri. Everything about that withdrawal depended on a single condition. The road had to be reopened, and the pass at its midpoint had to be in friendly hands when the column arrived. If Toktong Pass belonged to the Chinese, 8,000 men, their vehicles, their artillery, and every one of their wounded would be trapped at the end of a mountain valley in December with no way out. Fox Company was the condition. What happened to a unit in that campaign that could not hold was demonstrated on the other side of the reservoir at the same time in circumstances that were not meaningfully different. East of the frozen water, an army task force built around the 31st Infantry Regiment had advanced up the shoreline and was hit on the same night by 2 Chinese divisions. Its commander, Colonel Alan McLean, disappeared during the fighting and was later determined to have died in Chinese hands. Command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Don Carlos Faith. For 3 days, the task force held a perimeter under attack and then attempted to break out south toward Hagaru-ri along the lake road, carrying its wounded on trucks. The column was ambushed repeatedly and ceased to exist as a formation. Faith was killed leading it and received the Medal of Honor. Of a force numbering somewhere near 3,000 men, roughly 1,000 reached friendly lines, mostly by walking across the ice of the reservoir itself in the dark. Of those, 385 were physically fit to fight. Faith's body was left behind on that road. It remained there for more than half a century. His remains were recovered from a mass grave near the reservoir in 2004, identified by DNA analysis in 2012, and buried at Arlington in April 2013, 62 years after he was killed. The difference between that outcome and Fox Company's was not courage, and it was not the quality of the men. It was position, preparation, and the fact that Barber's company was dug in on high ground with registered fire support before the first shot was fired, instead of strung out along a road when it was cut. By the third morning, the character of the fight on Fox Hill had changed. The Chinese no longer attempted to overrun the position in a single rush. They had taken the higher ground to the south, the rocky knoll and the ridge beyond it, and from there they held the Marines under observed rifle fire through every hour of daylight. Lieutenant Peterson's platoon cleared the crest at dawn and re-established the line at cost. Movement anywhere on the open hilltop drew fire. Men were hit carrying ammunition between holes and carrying wounded to the aid station, a tent pitched inside the perimeter where the corpsmen worked with instruments they had to keep warm against their own bodies. Marines learned to crawl the length of the position rather than walk it. The company adapted in ways that read as improvisation and were in fact necessity. Since foxholes could not be deepened, the Marines built upward instead, and after the second night the only material lying within reach of their holes was the Chinese dead. Survivors described stacking them as parapets without much discussion about it, because the alternative was lying flat on open rock in the path of aim fire. Marines stuffed empty sleeping bags with snow and left them in visible positions to draw shots and reveal where snipers were firing from. They took white quilted padding from Chinese casualties and used it as camouflage against the snow, because Marine field jackets were dark and showed against the slope at any distance. They also slept in shifts of an hour or two at most, in cold that made unconsciousness genuinely dangerous, and by the fourth day the accumulated exhaustion was doing as much damage as the enemy. Officers had to check men physically at intervals to establish whether they were asleep or dying. What kept the hill alive through the middle of that week was not infantry. It was 2 things the Chinese could not answer. The first was fire support. Lieutenant Campbell, on the hill, could talk to Captain Reed's howitzers at Hagaru-ri. At extreme range, Reed's gunners walked air-bursting shells across the ground where Chinese assault troops formed up. Because Brady had registered his tubes on that high ground in daylight, he could drop rounds onto it at night without adjusting a single setting. In the morning, Marine Corsairs of Marine Air Group 33 came over the ridgeline and worked the slopes with machine guns, rockets, bombs and napalm, sometimes within 100 yards of the Marine holes. Close air support at that distance from the perimeter was not routine work, and it was not safe for anybody involved. Corsair pilots were being asked to deliver ordnance onto a knoll separated from friendly troops by less than the length of a rifle range, in a valley with steep walls that forced shallow approaches, in weather that closed the ridges without warning. Marines on the hill marked their own positions with panels and coloured smoke, and then lay flat while aircraft ran in over their heads. Napalm was used on the high ground because nothing else would clear troops out of rock crevices, and men in the forward holes felt the heat of it. Aviation in this campaign functioned as the Marines' artillery, their supply line, and in the end, their casualty evacuation, and the doctrine that made it possible had been argued over for a decade beforehand. The Marine Corps had spent the interwar and post-war years insisting that its air arm existed primarily to support its infantry, rather than to conduct an independent air campaign, and had been criticized for the parochialism of that position. At Chosin, that argument was settled in the most direct way available. The second was resupply from the air. Cut off completely, Fox Company received everything it consumed by parachute. Marine transport crews came in low and slow, repeatedly, and put their loads directly onto panels laid out on the hilltop while taking small arms fire from the surrounding ground. Air Force cargo aircraft dropping from higher altitude were far less accurate. A significant proportion of those loads drifted off the hill into the valley, some of it into Chinese hands. Parachutes failed, and crates smashed on impact. Some containers, when opened, held ammunition that did not fit any weapon the company carried. Against this, the Chinese had darkness, numbers, and nothing else. And the cold was killing them faster than it was killing the Marines, because the Marines at least had cold weather gear, hot food occasionally, and a supply line that ran vertically instead of along a road. The conditions on that hill are difficult to convey without sounding rhetorical, so it is better to be specific about what the temperature actually did to equipment. Lubricating oil in rifles and automatic weapons thickened into a paste, and weapons that had been properly oiled would not cycle. Marines stripped the oil off their bolts and worked their actions by hand every few minutes through the night to keep them from freezing shut. Machine gun barrels had to be fired periodically for the same reason. Batteries for radios and field telephones lost their charge in hours rather than days, and a helicopter that came in during the siege delivered replacement batteries because without them, the artillery link would have died. Rations froze into solid blocks that had to be thawed inside a man's clothing before they could be eaten. Blood plasma froze and became useless. Morphine syrettes froze, and corpsmen carried them inside their mouths to keep them warm enough to inject. The cold had one grim mercy. Wounds closed and clotted almost immediately in that air. A number of men on Fox Hill who would have bled to death in a temperate climate did not, and because the ground could not be dug, the Marines eventually did the only thing left available to them. They built parapets out of what was in front of their holes, which by the third day meant the frozen bodies of the men who had attacked them. On the fourth night, the Chinese made their most direct attempt, and it was destroyed in about 10 minutes. Rather than infiltrating in the dark to close range, a force of several companies came across the open ground below the position in a frontal assault. Everything Barber had spent 4 days arranging was waiting for it. The registered mortars fired without adjustment. The machine guns had interlocking fields of fire across exactly that approach. And Red's howitzers, 7 miles away, put air-bursting shells over the assault as it crossed. Marine accounts of that engagement put the Chinese dead in the hundreds. Fox Company had 1 man wounded. Chinese units across the reservoir made use of English-language appeals during the campaign, calling on surrounded Americans to give themselves up on the grounds that resistance was pointless and that they would be well treated. Nothing of that kind produced a result at Toktung Pass. Fox Company's problem over those 5 days was never morale. It was ammunition, replacements, and the number of men still able to hold a rifle. By the 5th night, the fighting on the hill had taken on a quality that survivors found harder to describe than the violence of the first. The attacks were still coming, but they were smaller and slower, and they were being made by men who were visibly at the end of their physical capacity. Marines in the forward holes could hear movement on the slope for long periods without anything happening because the Chinese assault troops were taking far longer to close the distance than they had on the first night. Fox Company was in no condition to be complacent about it. Ammunition had to be rationed, and Barber gave orders restricting fire to identified targets, which on a dark hillside is a difficult thing to ask of exhausted men. The company's effective strength had fallen to a figure that would not normally be considered capable of holding a perimeter of that size at all, and a growing proportion of the men still in the line were wounded, frostbitten, or both, and were fighting because there was nowhere to send them. What neither side could see clearly was that the Chinese regiment in front of the hill was in worse condition than the company on top of it. Its soldiers had been in the open in those mountains for the same 5 days without shelter, without a supply line capable of feeding them, and without any of the air support, artillery, or air-dropped rations that were reaching the Marines. Their casualties from the cold alone across the army group would ultimately exceed their casualties from combat by a wide margin. The siege of Fox Hill did not end because the Chinese were beaten in a conventional sense. It ended because a defended position with an air bridge could outlast an attacking force without one, and because the attacking force ran out of men who could still walk uphill. The persistence of the attacks is itself the most revealing thing about how the Chinese command was reading the situation. Songshailan's timetable had been built on the assumption that any block on that road could be brushed aside in a single night. By the fourth day, he was committing men against one hilltop that he needed for an operation that had already failed elsewhere, at a moment when his own soldiers were freezing to death in the assembly areas waiting to go in. The relief, when it finally came, did not come up the road. It came over the mountains. On December 1, the two regiments at Udamni began the breakout southeast toward Hagaruri. Colonel Litzenberg had concluded that the road itself could not be forced quickly enough, because every ridge above it was held. So he ordered the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis to leave the road entirely, climb into the mountains at night, and march overland across the ridgelines to reach Fox Hill from behind. The reasoning behind that order deserves to be stated plainly because it was a genuine gamble and it was understood as one at the time. Sending a battalion off the road at night in those temperatures into mountains held by an enemy of unknown strength meant putting it beyond the reach of vehicles, beyond artillery support for most of the route, and beyond any possibility of reinforcement. If Davis's battalion was stopped on a ridge somewhere in the dark, it would simply be a second surrounded unit, and there would be nothing left to send after it. Against that, Litzenberg had watched 3 separate attempts to force the road fail in 3 days. Davis put a small point element at the head of the column under Lieutenant Chu Ian Lee, the first Asian American officer to hold a regular commission in the Marine Corps, who had already been wounded in the arm earlier in the campaign and had discharged himself from a hospital to rejoin the battalion. Lee led the column through the first ridgeline in darkness. The straight line distance was about 4.5 miles. Over the ground they actually had to cross. It was closer to 8 or 9. They went in darkness, in deep snow, in a wind that made navigation almost impossible, carrying their own mortars and ammunition and their wounded over 3 successive ridge systems held in places by Chinese troops. Men fell asleep standing during halts and had to be physically shaken awake because sleep in those conditions meant death. Davis navigated by compass bearing, checked constantly because there was nothing to navigate by. Marines behind him described a march conducted in a state close to hallucination. The battalion fought through Chinese positions on the high ground as it went, took casualties, and kept moving. At around 11:25 in the morning on December 2, 1950, the lead elements came over the ridge above Toktong Pass and made contact with Fox Company. The relationship between those two units at that moment is one of the few things in this story that has a note of grace in it. Barber's Marines had been fighting for 5 nights and were down to a fraction of their strength. Davis's Marines had just spent a night crossing mountains in the dark. Barber's first offer was to send men out to help Davis's battalion in. The hill had held for 5 days and 6 nights. The pass was open. The column from Udamni came through it, and by December 4, the 2 regiments that had been trapped on the far side of the reservoir had closed on Hagaruri, with their vehicles, their guns, and their wounded. Fox Company's final accounting on that hill was 26 killed, 89 wounded, and 3 missing. When it came down, only about 82 of its Marines were able to walk unaided. Nearly every man who did walk had some degree of frostbite. Around the position, the Marines counted approximately 1,000 Chinese dead. Barber's citation for the Medal of Honor puts the arithmetic in the flattest possible language. It states that when the company was relieved, only 82 of his original 220 men were able to walk away from the position they had defended. That figure of 220 is worth explaining because it is the source of most of the confusion around this story. Barber himself had reported 234 Marines when he occupied the hill. Adding the 12 Navy corpsmen brings the number to 246, and the Korean interpreter makes 247. The 220 in the citation almost certainly reflects rifle strength rather than the full reinforced total. Popular retellings tend to pick whichever number sounds best and state it as fact. The honest answer is that somewhere between 220 and 247 men held that hill, and the difference is a matter of who is being counted, not of what happened to them. The same caution applies to the number on the other side, and it applies more strongly. The 59th Chinese Division numbered somewhere around 10,000 men on paper, and it was that division which encircled the Toktong sector and cut the road along its length. But those 10,000 men were not all at Fox Hill, and they never were. The division had a wide frontage to hold and multiple road cuts to maintain, and it was simultaneously fighting Marine units at other points. The force that actually assaulted Barber's position amounted to roughly a reinforced regiment, committed piecemeal in battalion-sized attacks across 5 nights. That is a substantially smaller number than the one usually quoted, and it is also a far more impressive one because it is real. A rifle company of about 240 men, holding a bare hill in sub-zero cold, destroyed a force several times its size and inflicted roughly 1,000 fatalities while losing 26 dead. Nothing about that requires inflation. The wider campaign resolved over the following 2 weeks, and the numbers involved dwarf anything that happened at the pass. The 1st Marine Division fought its way down the road from Hagaru-ri to Koto-ri, and from Koto-ri through Funchalin Pass to the coast. At the pass, retreating Chinese engineers had destroyed a bridge over a gorge with no bypass, leaving a gap that no vehicle could cross. On December the 7th, Air Force transports parachuted 8 sections of portable steel bridging to the Marines at Koto-ri, an operation that had never been attempted before. One section fell into Chinese hands and another was damaged on landing, which is precisely why 8 had been requested when 4 were needed. Engineers assembled the rest across the gorge, and on December 9th the division drove out over a bridge that had been delivered by parachute. Before any of that could happen, the division had to solve the problem of its wounded, and the solution was the airstrip that Oliver Smith had ordered built at Hagaru-ri without authorization while everyone above him was urging speed. Engineers had been scraping that strip out of frozen ground for 2 weeks, working with equipment that had to be kept running continuously because it would not restart once cold. It was unfinished, too short by the standards of the aircraft using it, and surrounded by an enemy in contact. Transport aircraft began landing on it at the beginning of December anyway, bringing in ammunition and replacements and taking out casualties on every return leg. More than 4,300 wounded and frostbitten men were flown out of Hagaru-ri in the space of 6 days. Almost none of them could have survived the road. The airstrip is the reason the division was able to march out of the mountains as a fighting formation rather than as a column encumbered by thousands of stretchers it could not protect. That decision had been made in the middle of November by a general whose caution was at the time considered a problem. The evacuation from the port of Hungnam ran from December 9th to December the 24th, 1950. Roughly 105,000 troops were lifted out, together with something on the order of 17,500 vehicles and 350,000 tons of cargo. Alongside them went the civilians. Around 91,000 refugees were evacuated through Hungnam itself, and the fuller total, including other northeastern ports, comes to roughly 98,000. A single freighter, the Meredith Victory, took aboard something close to 14,000 people in a vessel built to carry a crew of about 47, in what remains the largest evacuation of civilians by one ship in maritime history. On the Chinese side, the accounting was not published for decades. Official Chinese figures released in 1988 put the 9th Army Group's losses in the Chosin campaign at 21,366 combat casualties, of which 7,304 were killed, plus a further 30,732 non-battle casualties, the overwhelming majority of them from frostbite and exposure. Taken together, that is well over a third of the entire Army Group, and it was inflicted in a campaign lasting a few weeks. The 9th Army Group was withdrawn from the line and was not fit to fight again for roughly 3 months. It had achieved its strategic object in the narrow sense. The United Nations advance in the northeast was reversed and northeastern Korea was abandoned. But the 1st Marine Division, which Song Shilun had intended to annihilate in the mountains, came out of the reservoir intact in formation, carrying its equipment and its wounded, and it was back in the line within weeks. There is one more entry in the ledger, and it concerns what the men involved did afterward with what had happened to them. William Barber received the Medal of Honor from President Truman in August 1952. He stayed in the Marine Corps for another 18 years. He served in Vietnam as a psychological operations officer with the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force and retired as a colonel in 1970. He gave interviews late in life, particularly to marine historians, and when he did, he was consistently uncomfortable with the way the story was told. He deflected credit toward the company. He noted more than once that the decision to stay on the hill was an ordinary tactical judgment rather than an act of defiance, and that had he been wrong about it, everyone would have died, and the judgment would have looked like stupidity. He died in April 2002 in Irvine, California. Hector Cafferata stood in front of the same president 3 months later, in November 1952, for the same battle. He He never fully recovered the use of his hand. He went home to New Jersey, ran a tavern, worked for the state's Fish and Wildlife Division, and for most of his life declined to discuss the hill at any length with anyone who was not there. The one campaign he did pursue was on behalf of somebody else. He spent years arguing that Kenneth Benson, the half-blind Marine who had loaded his rifles in the dark, had never been properly recognized. Benson received the Silver Star in the year 2000, 50 years after the night in question, largely because Cafferata would not let the matter drop. Cafferata died in April 2016. A United States Navy Expeditionary Sea Base now carries his name. Raymond Davis, who brought his battalion over the mountains, also received the Medal of Honor for that march. He stayed in uniform a further 22 years, commanded the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam, rose to 4-star general, and served as Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. In retirement, he devoted years to the effort that produced the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, largely because he considered the war's disappearance from American public memory an injustice to the men who fought it. He died in 2003. Homer Litzenberg, the officer who had looked at the map and detached a company to a hill for reasons he could not fully justify at the time, held the rank of colonel throughout the campaign, went on to command at divisional level, and was advanced to lieutenant general on his retirement in 1959. He received no decoration for that particular decision, which is unsurprising because there is no award in any military for correctly guessing where a road will be cut. He died in 1963. The Chosin campaign produced an extraordinary concentration of decorations, 17 medals of honor in total, 14 of them to Marines. 3 of those 17 came out of the fight for one hill above one mountain pass. The ground itself is unreachable. Toktong Pass lies inside North Korea, and no American has stood on that hill since December 1950. The survivors organized themselves into an association they called the Chosin Few, held reunions for half a century, and gradually stopped holding them as the membership died. The units that fought there have had different fates in the 2 countries that remember them differently. The 59th Chinese Division was disbanded in 1985 during Deng Xiaoping's reduction of the People's Liberation Army. The 20th Army itself, the parent formation, survived until the sweeping structural reforms of 2017, when it was dissolved as part of the reorganization of China's ground forces into a smaller number of group armies. Song Shilun was criticized within the Chinese command for the scale of his losses at Chosin, requested punishment for himself in writing, and was subsequently moved into military education and historical work. He spent much of his later career as head of the People's Liberation Army's Academy of Military Science and supervised the compilation of its major military encyclopedia. He died in 1991. In China, the campaign is not a footnote. It is one of the foundational episodes of what is officially called the War to Resist United States Aggression and Aid Korea, and it has been actively promoted in recent years. In 2021, a state-commissioned film about the battle at Lake Changjin, was produced with the involvement of the National Film Regulator, the Central Military Commission, and the Communist Party's propaganda apparatus, and directed by 3 of the country's most prominent filmmakers. It took something in the region of $913 million worldwide and became the highest-grossing film in Chinese history, holding that position until it was displaced in February 2025. A sequel followed in 2022. Both films present the campaign as a victory of will over material superiority, and both have been criticized in South Korea and elsewhere for their treatment of the historical record. There is a reason the Chinese state finds the story useful, and it is not sentimental. The lesson being promoted is that a technologically inferior force can defeat a technologically superior one through mass, endurance, and willingness to absorb casualties. That argument is being made to a domestic audience at a moment when the People's Liberation Army is preparing for the possibility of a confrontation with the United States in the Western Pacific, and when the original object of the 9th Army Group, the invasion of Taiwan that was cancelled in 1950, has returned to the center of Chinese strategic planning. The armistice that ended the fighting in Korea in 1953 was never replaced by a peace treaty. The war has not formally ended. The line drawn across the peninsula still runs where the fighting stopped, and it is still the most heavily fortified border on Earth. There was no decisive weapon in this fight. Nothing was invented. Nothing was rushed to the front. Nothing arrived in time to change the odds. Both sides had the equipment they had brought with them, and the Chinese plan for the reservoir was tactically sound almost everywhere it was applied. It failed at the one point where failure was fatal to it, and it failed there for a reason that has nothing to do with material at all. Homer Litzenberg looked at a map on the afternoon of November the 27th, 1950, found the place where a cut would be fatal, and put a rifle company on it as a precaution against something he had no evidence was coming. William Barber then declined the one order that would have let him leave. Everything the 1st Marine Division did over the following 3 weeks, every mile of that road, the bridge dropped by parachute, the 100,000 men and the 90,000 civilians taken off the beach at Hungnam, ran back through the 7 miles of gravel that Fox Company kept open. 8,000 Marines walked south through Toktong Pass in the first days of December 1950. 82 of the men who held it walked down the hill on their own feet.